Okay, part 8. Remember now, Charlotte has Mr. Milshark with her on the coach. I know my horses by heart, and I'm not one for bad driving, so you hold tight, hollered Charlotte. Nervously, Mr. Milshark said, "You're the boss." "Giddy up," she yelled, giving the horses more rein and enjoying this moment, this power over Milshark. She loved the thrill of being the master of her team. Charlotte looked at him. He seemed pitiful, hanging onto the rails for dear life. Why, she wasn't even going that fast. She knew which roads might be flooded after a rain, which might be cluttered with branches after a storm, and which were muddy. A few days earlier, on this same road, she got stuck in a mud bog near the Johnsons' farm. Today, she would have to go around by another road to miss the bog. But suddenly, she felt some childish urge for revenge and had an idea. She gave the team a loud whistle and drove them directly toward the middle of the bog. The stagecoach mired in the doughy mud, but Charlotte wasn't worried. The passengers weren't in any danger, and she'd still get them to their stops on time. "Well, if that don't beat all," said Charlotte. "We're stuck," said Mr. Milshark. "Let's get her out. You get some brush under her wheels so I can guide her out to the other side." "I beg your pardon," said Mr. Milshark. "Well, I'm the only one that can drive this team. Them women and the coach are only good for cooking and sewing. I need a strong hand to help me, or else we might just be here till this mud dries off. I'd recommend taking off those fancy boots and them fine stockings, though." Mr. Milshark reluctantly peeled them off and got down from the coach. He sank in the mud up to his ankles. He picked up his feet slowly, sinking farther into the mud with each step. He dragged some tree branches over and placed them under the wheels of the stagecoach. Inside, the coach was cozy, paneled with brass wood and lit with oil lanterns with brass fittings. The small windows had leather shades that could be pulled down to protect the passengers from weather or dust. "Pull down those window shades, ladies," Charlotte yelled. "Don't want you getting muddy." Trying not to chuckle, Charlotte stayed up in the box seat and worked the horses back and forth. Each time the wheels turned, Mr. Milshark got sprayed with mud. Finally, Charlotte maneuvered the stage out of the bog and waited farther up the road than she needed for Mr. Milshark to catch up. "Good man," said Charlie. "Thank you." Mr. Milshark climbed up top, but he didn't say a word. On the way to the next town, Charlotte drove as safe as was safe. When she glanced at Mr. Milshark, he looked as pale as milk. It was hours later when Charlotte stopped the stage. "Well, here we are, first stop," she said. "My boots?" said Mr. Milshark. Charlotte looked around. "They were here, sure as I'm here," said Charlotte. "They must have dropped out on the way. That's a pity. Well, I suppose we could go back and take a look for them." "No," said Mr. Milshark. "I mean, no need." He held out a coin and said, "If you see those boots again, I'd appreciate you retrieving them. They were specially ordered. Very expensive." "Yes, sir," said Charlotte. She took the coin and hopped down from the seat. She pulled off her kerchief from her face and busied herself with the baggage. Mr. Milshark was covered with a dried crust of mud and still complaining about his sore bottom and lost boots. He climbed down and came over to Charlotte. Charlotte looked at him, nodded, and handed him his bags. A glimmer of recognition crossed Mr. Milshark's face. "You look familiar," he said. "Oh, that's what a lot of folks say," said Charlotte, and she hopped back up in the box seat and readied the horses before he could respond. Mr. Milshark had a puzzled look on his face as he walked barefooted into the hotel. And hidden in the leather storage were a new pair of boots for Ebenezer. Chapter 7. Two of Ebenezer's stable boys, James Birch and Frank Stevens, had left Rhode Island some years ago for California. Now they were back and as excited as two puppy dogs about their adventures. They were full of stories about Argonauts, the gold diggers, and Charlotte couldn't get enough of their tales. The West was wild and untamed. Prospectors flocking to pan for gold up and down the lower Sierras were becoming millionaires overnight. And Sacramento, everyone was talking about Sacramento, California, the most important river port in the West. It was a boom town, and for a businessman, it was as tempting as a candy store, because if a man struck it rich, he'd have to have some place to take his gold and some place to spend his worth. "People got to get from one place to another," said James, "so we started a small stage line. But now we're joining with other lines to start the California Stage Company. And we need good drivers. We need men in the mother lode where all the gold is. When they're mining, where they're mining, and where we're planning to expand routes up and down the Pacific coast. So you'd have your pick. Won't you come, Charlie? The money was good, and there was plenty of work for men that would go. But what interested Charlotte most was the talk about the land. If you're looking to own any, it's cheap and plentiful, said Frank. Charlotte couldn't help but be excited. James persisted. We've secured boat passage from Atlanta to Panama. You would travel overland by mule through Panama, then secure a ship to San Francisco, and then take a riverboat to Sacramento. It's a month's journey, but when you get there, there's land as far as the eye can see, just waiting to be bought by you, Charlie. Their enthusiasm was catching. Well, boys, that land sounds mighty appealing, said Charlotte. Come on, Charlie, you're the best driver we know, and we need you, said James. Charlotte knew from the minute they started talking about the land that she would go, but she had to tell Ebenezer, and that wouldn't be easy. It ain't a pony ride out there in California, Ebenezer practically shouted. In some places, there ain't roads, just worn-down trails made by pack mules that went afore you. The ground is filled with chuck holes, and you'll be knee-hole in dust. Yes, sir, but I need to go, said Charlotte. You don't know what you're in for. Most of the horses are just wild mustangs they brought in from the foothills that don't know how to work in the traces. You'll only make 3 miles an hour on a good day. He paced back and forth. I hear the coaches are loaded with folks heading for the mining towns that they have to put passengers on the roof. You'll lose them off the top. And you got other things to consider, Charlie. California ain't no place for for you. Ebenezer had never once, not once, said anything about Charlotte's secret. He had never confronted her. He'd never asked her outright, but he knew. He rubbed his hands over his bald head. Charlotte tried to explain. I aim to get me a ranch, and I won't ever be able to afford it here in the East, she said. Out west, there's land to be had, cheap. I don't want to spend the rest of my life sleeping in a loft. I want to get me a place, my own place, a home. He stopped pacing, crossed his arms, and said, What about Indians? You thought about that? Carrying all that bullion, while a robber will look at you and think you're plumb ripe for the picking. Charlotte didn't answer him. She knew she was going, and so did he. Ebenezer sat down. He looked defeated. You're my best driver. I know I never said anything, but, well, you remind me of somebody. And it's just done my heart real good to see you outdo all those other drivers, all them other boys. His voice drifted off. I had a child once, a girl. She died from the fever, same as my wife. But that little girl, she could ride like the wind. I ain't never seen anything like it, except you. He was quiet, and Charlotte walked over and took his hand. I guess I put more stock in having you around than I should, he said. I just hate to lose you to California. Charlotte didn't want to lose Ebenezer either. He had been good to her. He had let her make her own way. He had protected her like a daughter. I just bet when I get my place, you could come out and start a livery, said Charlotte. You heard them boys talking. Sounds pretty exciting, don't it? His ears perked up a little at the prospect. I'll need you out there, she said. I aim to get me a piece of land, and why I can't run a big place all by myself. I guess I could think about it, said Ebenezer, down the line. Guess I'm not too old to travel. Maybe someday. They looked at each other. He half smiled. Well, get going and pack your things. I told you a long time ago that working for me would be temporary. Don't you get harmed out there. And you need anything, you holler. By now, Charlotte understood his blustery ways. Excuse me. Thank you, she said. Hey, what's your name anyway? He grumbled. She smiled and bent over and whispered it in his ear.